In this video, we will learn to create and modify pivot tables, specifically pivot tables in one variable. The reason that we make pivot tables is because you want to summarize information within a table. For example, if you wanted to find the total amount spent on all electricity payments, what you would want to do is add together all of the amounts spent where the category is electricity. For example, if we scroll down to the data set, we can see here's an electricity, here's another one, etc. We'd have to add together all of those numbers. Of course, in a small data set like this one, it's not too hard to pick out the electricity payments, but imagine if you had thousands of rows. We need a more efficient way to do this. There is a function in order to do this in Excel where you can do calculations with values that match a specific criteria. They are called summary if functions. For example, SUMIF, COUNTIF, and AVERAGEIF can find the sum, count, and average of values that match specific criteria. The criteria can be defined in many ways. For example, they could be something like category is electricity, or amount spent exactly equal to 1570, or amount spent greater than 100 or less than 300. You can really check any criteria you want to, and then do a calculation based on that criteria. For example, if we go back down to our data set, we could use a SUMIF function to find the total amount spent just on electricity without doing it by picking out all of the electricity payments. In order to do that, I would just type in equals SUMIF. The first argument is range, so that is where you're looking for the name electricity. It would be in this whole category column. The next argument is the criteria. That would be where we state electricity is the type of category we're interested in. Notice that because it's text, it should be in quotation marks. The third argument is what values you want to add together. That is the amount spent. So if the category is electricity, add together the amount spent. Then you'll press enter, and Excel will add together those individual electricity payments. However, what if we also wanted to add all the mortgage payments together and all the car payments together, all the heat, all the phone, and internet? You would have to do a SUMIF for each of these categories. That can be very time consuming. So instead, a faster way to do this and a more user-friendly way is to use what's called a pivot table. A pivot table is an interactive Excel table that can do any function, sum, count, average, etc., according to specific criteria. So basically, it does the work of multiple SUMIF functions or multiple AVERAGEIF functions in a very quick way. Inserting a pivot table is very easy. You click anywhere in an Excel table. Then once you've clicked on the Excel table, you'll go to the Insert tab on the main ribbon here and press the Pivot Table button. From there, it will launch the Pivot Table dialog box that looks like this, where it will ask you the name of the table that you are converting to a pivot table and where you want to place it. By default, it will try to place it in a new worksheet, or you can say you want to place it in an existing worksheet if you say where you want it to go. I'll show you an example of this. We want to create a pivot table based on this table here and place it just somewhere down here below the instructions. In order to do that, I can click anywhere inside of this table, then make sure I navigate to the Insert tab and press the Pivot Table button. Notice that Excel automatically senses I want to build a table from the quarter, or a pivot table from the quarter budget table. And I'm going to place this in the same worksheet that I'm already in, so we don't have to keep switching back and forth. That means I need to change to existing worksheet. And for the location, I'm going to select K88. Once I've selected that, I will press OK. And what happens is I get this blank area that's called a blank pivot table report. I'll show you a little bit more about this. In the instructions up here, it shows you that this is called our empty pivot table report that we then can use to build a full pivot table. The great thing about pivot tables is they're meant to be user-friendly, so drag and drop. What's meant by that is as soon as you click anywhere in the blank pivot table report, this pivot table fields dialog box will appear on the side. If you don't see it, make sure you're clicked on this empty pivot table anywhere inside. Go to the Pivot Table Analyze tab on the main ribbon and make sure the Field List button is turned on. Then you'll be able to see the pivot table fields, which are the most important feature for building a pivot table. All of your variable field names are listed here. And you can then select these and drag them into what are called your pivot table areas: filters, columns, rows, and values. We're going to start with the simplest kind of pivot table, which is just to build a table based off of one field in the rows and a field in the values. In this scenario, the field that you drag into the rows will become the criteria that you summarize on. Just like for the SUMIF function, we were looking for the electricity category. We would put the category into the rows, so then you would get each category separately: mortgage, car, electricity, etc. And you'd get a listing of all of those categories. Then what did we want to do for electricity? We wanted to add together the amount spent. That means the amount spent would go into the values because it's what you want to do a calculation for. We would end up with a table that then looks like this if we followed those steps. The one that we drag into the rows in the purple becomes the headings for the categories. The value that we drag into the values, that's kind of in that green-blue color, then becomes what the calculation, the numerical amount is inside of this table. It's in the middle area as shown in this diagram. In order to then edit your pivot table, the key features are the Pivot Table Analyze tab and the Pivot Table Design tab to make it look more visually appealing. We will build a pivot table and experiment with some of these pieces. The first important step for building your pivot table is how exactly do you drag and drop and what exactly does your output look like. The first thing you need to do is click anywhere inside of the blank pivot table report. Then, because I said we want to summarize the categories for the budget, category will go in the rows. You'll click on category and drag it into the rows section, and Excel will automatically tell you all of the different types of categories for the budget. Then, for those different types of budget, we want to find the amount spent. So I click on amount spent and drag it into the values. This does exactly the same work that the SUMIF did for electricity spending, but not just for electricity. It's for every single type of category in the budget. And that's the power of a pivot table. It finds the amount spent based on the categories. In terms of making the pivot table look a bit nicer, we do want to format these amounts spent in accounting format. Instead of just selecting the values and pressing the accounting symbol, because that won't stick with your values if you need to change your pivot table, what you should do instead is go down to the value section of the pivot table, because then if you need to update the pivot table, the formatting will still apply if you use this method. You'll click the drop-down menu and go to Value Field Settings. Then right within this Value Field Settings, you have the number formats, where you can say we want to put this into accounting, and press OK. And OK again. Now, if you change the pivot table, the updated formatting will stick with you. And that's what's described up here. You can always use the value field settings to change how the numbers inside of the pivot table are displayed and their formatting. Finally, if you want to make it look a little bit nicer, you can change the style. You can see we kind of got this blue color by default, but if you click anywhere inside of the pivot table and go to the design tool, we can change up what it looks like. For example, if we wanted to use this one, light gray pivot style medium 18, which is the one I recommended on the main ribbon. Our pivot table has the black headers and gray for the inner categories. Pivot tables take a bit of practice, so we're going to create one more right down here. First, we're going to click anywhere inside of our original table, the quarterly budget, go to the Insert tab, and press Pivot Table. This time, we're told to select location K10. So I click in that location box, select K110. Sorry, I think I said 10, it's K110. And press OK. This time, we're told to drag the method paid into the rows. Here we go. The instructions also say to drag method paid again into the values. So let's see what happens when we do that. Because so far, I told you values do math. That's what goes here. So for these different categories like credit, debit, and direct, you'd want to do math with them. But if we drag method paid into the values again, method paid is text, either credit, debit, or direct. So you can't add together or average text. So what Excel does instead is it counts how many of each type of payment you have. So if you have something like different categories, credit, debit, and direct, and you just want to figure out a count of how many you have of each, you can put the same variable in the rows and the values. So you get a table like this one, where you have the different listings, the different categories for method paid, and the count of how many times each category is used. This is just to show you do not have to use the same variable or different variables in the rows and values. You can actually use the same one. Finally, we are going to format this one in style light gray, light 15 by clicking anywhere in the table, going over to design, and I'm looking for light gray, light 15. Here it is. So we have made two different pivot tables, but both only with one variable. What I mean by that is we're listing one variable here and counting how many times each of those appear. Here we're listing one variable in the rows, summing the total money spent in each of those categories. In future videos, we are going to examine what happens if you want to use two or more variables inside of the pivot table for the categorizations. But whether you're making the pivot table more complex or just doing one variable in the categories, the most important thing to remember is that pivot tables are meant to be interactive and summarize calculations based on specific criteria, just like a SUMIF function can do, but it's a faster way and a more user-friendly way of doing it.